Sir, Mr. Coleman, according to the records, you've been dead for 6 months. The woman on the other end of the phone said it calmly. Her voice was flat, as if she were announcing the opening hours of a grocery store. I thought I had misheard. 6 months ago, I was still mowing the lawn in front of my house, paying my property taxes on time, writing donation checks for the old church where my wife and I used to sit in the back pew. I was still driving my old Ford to the lakeshore every afternoon, casting a fishing line and watching the water lie flat and quiet. But her voice did not hesitate. She said my retirement insurance file, my assets, and a series of legal documents under my name had already been fully processed. I've lived for more than 60 years, and I once thought the most frightening thing was growing old alone. Maybe I was wrong. What's far more frightening is when someone quietly steps into your life and starts living it for you while you're still sitting there, breathing, one breath at a time. I'm telling this story because maybe, somewhere out there, you trusted the wrong person too, just like I did. Before I continue, let me ask you, where are you listening to this story right now? In a familiar kitchen, on an old chair in the garage, or on a quiet evening after everyone else has gone to sleep? Leave me a comment and let me know. If this story touches you, please press like, subscribe to the channel, and stay until the end of the video to discover what happens next. My name is Arthur Coleman. I am 67 years old. I have been a widower for 4 years. I live alone in a small wooden house by a lake in Minnesota, where winters are so long and quiet you can almost hear the snow settling on the porch roof. I worked as an electrical engineer for nearly 35 years, retired on schedule, not wealthy but comfortable enough. From the outside, my life looked simple, and maybe that simplicity is exactly what made me careless. The call earlier came from the retirement insurance company I had contributed to for 3 decades, a place so familiar I could recite my contract number by memory. I had called them just to ask about a routine interest rate adjustment. A small thing, almost a habit, but instead of the usual answer, I received that sentence. The woman explained that my beneficiary had completed the payout procedures 6 months ago. She asked why I was still calling, since the file had already been closed. I gave a strained laugh, assuming there had been some mistake. I stated my name, read out my social security number, answered a few security questions. There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Then her voice became more rigid. She said the system would not allow identity verification for me. The reason was simple and cold. A deceased person cannot complete direct verification. I set my coffee mug down on the table. My hand trembled slightly, not enough to spill it, just enough to make the coffee ripple. I asked where those documents had come from. She said there was a valid death certificate, confirmed signatures, proper stamps. Everything was in order. I didn't argue over the phone. Not because I believed her, but because I knew I needed to see it with my own eyes. I put on my coat, pulled on a knit cap, and stepped outside. The cold morning air sharpened my senses. My old Ford started after the second turn of the key, as usual. On the drive to the company's local office, my head wasn't empty. It was full of scattered images, quiet afternoons by the lake, times I signed papers without reading every line, casual remarks from family members I had brushed off as jokes. They didn't form a clear picture, but they were heavy enough to press on my chest. The office was in a low building, its sign faded by wind and snow. A young employee greeted me. He was polite, a little uneasy as he looked from the file on his screen to my face. After a few minutes of internal discussion, he printed out a stack of papers and placed them in front of me. A death certificate bearing my name, Arthur Coleman. Date of birth, address, everything correct. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like mine. Not vaguely similar, similar enough that, at a glance, even I would have nodded in agreement. The employee said quietly that the file had been submitted more than half a year ago. No disputes, no complaints. Everything had gone through smoothly enough that no one had questioned it. The sole beneficiary was clearly listed on the next page: Caleb Foster. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Caleb was my wife's son from her first marriage. I met him when he was 19, thin, always looking down. I helped him with school, let him stay with us when he first graduated, co-signed for his first car. I never once thought of the word inheritance when it came to Caleb. I only thought I was doing the right thing. Sitting in front of that stack of papers, I didn't slam the desk or raise my voice. I just felt a hollow open beneath my feet, as if someone had dug a pit long ago and I had finally stepped into it. I left the office when the sky had grown grayer. Snow drifted lightly. I didn't drive right away. I sat there for a few minutes, watching my breath fog the windshield. In my mind, only one question remained. Simple, yet unbearably heavy. Who buried me alive in my own life? When I got home, the living room lights were still off. I hung my coat on its usual hook, set my keys on the wooden shelf by the door. Everything was where it always had been, as if nothing had changed. But after a few steps, I stopped. The grandfather clock in the living room was still running. I hadn't adjusted it since my wife died. Yet the hour hand and the minute hand were exactly 6 months behind. I stood there for a long time without turning on the light. The faint glow from the porch was just enough to see the pendulum swinging back and forth as if it knew more than I did about what had happened. 6 months. No more, no less. I reached out and touched the cold wood lightly, then pulled my hand back. Some things, once they've gone off course, can't simply be reset. I sat down in the chair Helen used to read in at night. The cushion dipped slightly where her back once rested. The smell of old wood mixed with familiar laundry soap triggered memories without warning. Helen brought Caleb home on a rainy afternoon. He was 19, hair plastered to his forehead, an old backpack hanging crookedly off one shoulder. She stood in the doorway, her hand on his back, and said to me in a light voice, as if she'd prepared it long ago, "He'll be staying with us for a while." I looked at Caleb, thin, awkward, avoiding my eyes. I didn't ask many questions. Helen rarely asked for anything, and when she did, I usually nodded. In the early days, Caleb barely existed in the house. He went to school, worked part-time, came home late, ate quickly, and went upstairs. I noticed details more than words. Worn-down shoes, an old car that kept breaking down, overdue bills piling up in the kitchen drawer he forgot to hide. I wasn't his biological father, but I was used to handling the things no one else wanted to touch. I paid his tuition. I fixed his car twice in the same month. I called creditors and talked long enough to get them to agree to extensions. Caleb started calling me Dad after I wrote a check to cover his remaining tuition balance. He said it naturally, without hesitation. Helen smiled when she heard it. I didn't correct him. Some titles, once spoken, come with responsibility whether you ask for it or not. There was a time when Caleb got into deeper trouble. A personal loan in his name, high interest, short term. Helen paced the kitchen. Caleb sat at the table, head down, hands clasped. I pulled out my paperwork and co-signed without reading every line. I remember thinking only this: the boy needed an adult to step in, and I was the only one in that house who could do it. Even now, I still wonder, was that help love, or was I taking away his chance to grow up? People say parents must sacrifice everything. Others say loving someone means letting them take responsibility. What do you think? Have you ever helped your children or grandchildren out of love, only to realize later that you did it the wrong way? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know I'm not alone. Life went on in what I called a steady way. Helen died from a stroke, so fast no one had time to prepare. Caleb cried at the funeral more than I did. I never knew whether it was real grief or a reflex learned for moments that required tears. After the funeral, he stayed for a while, then moved out, saying he wanted independence. I supported him. I even helped with the security deposit on a small apartment near downtown. We still saw each other. Not often, but enough that I never felt left behind. Caleb stopped by on holidays, ate dinner, told small stories about work. Sometimes he called just to ask how I was doing. Those calls often ended with a joke. Once he laughed and said, "If you die, Dad, I won't have to worry about retirement money." I laughed along, a short, raspy laugh, the way older people respond to things they don't want to think about too deeply. I remember patting his shoulder and telling him I wasn't going anywhere. Now that sentence came back to me, so clear I could almost hear his laugh echoing in this kitchen. The next morning, I went back to the insurance office, not to argue, but to ask more specific questions. A different employee saw me this time, older, cautious. I asked who had submitted the death certificate. She checked the screen, typed a few lines, then looked up. The name wasn't long or complicated. Caleb Foster. I didn't react right away. I didn't slam the desk. I didn't ask why. I simply nodded, as if this was information I had been destined to hear. She explained the process. The certificate had been properly filed, the confirming signature matched previous co-signature records, the beneficiary was clearly listed. Everything had passed through the required checks. I drove home in silence. The road along the lake was coated with thin ice. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel. Old images lined up in my mind without being called. Caleb at 19 in the doorway. Caleb holding keys to his first car, saying, "Thank you, Dad." Caleb sitting across from me, watching my pen as I signed papers. I went into my small office. The bottom drawer was still locked. I opened it and pulled out the old files. Copies of co-signed documents, my signature neatly placed at the bottom. That signature, next to the one on the death certificate, was nearly indistinguishable. I had never been careful with paperwork. I always believed trust mattered more. That afternoon, Caleb called. His voice was the same, warm, a little rushed. He asked how I was, said he'd been busy lately. I answered briefly and didn't mention the morning. He said he'd stop by over the weekend. I agreed. After I hung up, I stared at the empty space in front of me. There was no sudden burst of anger, just a slow, spreading cold in my chest, as if I had discovered that something had been growing inside my home all along, eating at my table, calling me by a name I never asked for. For the first time in my life, I didn't ask what Caleb had done. I asked what I had done to let things get here. That night, I didn't sleep, not from fear, but because the house was too quiet. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the refrigerator cycle on and off, the wind brushing lightly against the north-facing window. I walked into Helen's old bedroom and pulled open the lower left drawer. The safe key was exactly where she always kept it, in a small wooden box lined with worn velvet. I hadn't opened that safe since she died, not out of respect for privacy, but because I believed there was nothing left to know. The safe opened with a dry click. Inside were familiar things: insurance certificates, old savings books, faded photographs. I flipped through them slowly. At the bottom was a thick brown envelope, sealed, unlabeled. When I pulled it out, the paper scraped my hand like dry sand. Inside was a neatly organized stack of documents, ordered too carefully to be accidental. A power of attorney, open-ended, broad in scope. My name printed clearly at the top. The signature at the bottom, slanted just as mine always was, pressure placed exactly where I placed it. If set beside my checkbook signature, the difference was almost non-existent. I stared long enough to feel a chill run down my spine. Some things, when they are that similar, are no longer coincidence. The next morning, I brought the papers to Miller's law office. The room hadn't changed, small, smelling of old paper and forgotten coffee. He put on his glasses and flipped through the pages slowly, without asking me anything. When he set them down, he spoke in the voice of someone used to delivering news no one wants to hear. Formally speaking, the signature is valid. I didn't ask more. I looked at the desk lamp casting light over the paper, where that familiar slant rested as if I had signed it myself the day before. Miller looked up, hesitating for a moment. At a glance, there's nothing to dispute. To go further, you'd need a forensic examination. I nodded and gathered the papers. That was enough. On the drive home, I didn't stop by the lake like I usually did. I drove straight back. As I turned into the driveway, a small rental truck was parked by the porch. The back door stood open. 2 men were carrying Helen's wooden cabinet, the one where she kept tablecloths and old photo albums. I braked hard. "What are you doing here?" I asked. One of them looked at me, still holding the cabinet. "Clearing items. Owner's request." Owner. The word landed quickly and cleanly, as if it had been rehearsed. I went inside. The living room felt emptier than usual. Helen's armchair was gone from the window corner. The grandfather clock stood silent, its batteries removed. On the dining table, several stacks of papers lay neatly arranged. Furniture sale agreements, receipts, a list of items to be moved this week. Caleb stood in the kitchen on the phone. When he saw me, he ended the call, calm. "I thought you'd be home later," he said. I asked about the truck. Caleb didn't dodge it. "I'm clearing things out. The house is too big. No point keeping all of it." I placed Miller's papers on the table. I didn't slide them toward him. I just set them down. Caleb glanced at them and knew immediately. No panic, just a short exhale. "You went to a lawyer?" he asked. "Since when?" I said. Caleb leaned against the sink, arms crossed. "A long time, before Mom died." He went on like he was presenting an approved plan. Old debts, risks, the future. He used the same words I had once used when advising him at 20. Outside, one of the movers called out, "Is there a small cabinet in the bedroom too?" Caleb turned and answered, "Yes, take everything." I walked toward the hallway. The bedroom door was open. Helen's vanity had been stripped of its drawers. I stood in the doorway, my hand gripping the frame tighter than necessary. "When did you learn my signature?" I asked without turning around. "Every time you wrote a check," Caleb said. "Every time you left papers on the table." He paused. "I just watched." The word "watched" dropped into the room. Light, sharp. I remembered evenings under warm light, the checkbook open, me signing a scrap of paper to show him. Back then, I thought I was teaching. I didn't know I was leaving data behind. That afternoon, the bank letter arrived. Thick envelope, clean, polite. I opened it on the porch. Re-mortgage notice, my name listed as borrower. The amount large enough to leave no doubt. The signature at the end, slanted, firm. I carried the envelope inside just as the truck returned. This time, they were carrying Helen's armchair. I rushed forward and put my hand on the side of it, stopping them. "Stop!" I snapped. The men froze and looked toward Caleb, who stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching me like a man dealing with an inconvenience. "Take your hand off," Caleb said evenly. "This house is in my name. Everything in it is mine to handle." "This is your mother's chair," I said, my voice starting to shake with anger. "She's gone," he replied flatly. "And you don't have the right to stop the homeowner from clearing their property. Don't make me call the police for causing a disturbance." I stood there, rooted to the floor. My hand was still gripping the arm of the chair, but the strength had already drained by half. Police, the law, ownership. Those words rose up like a glass wall in front of me. I could see everything, but I couldn't touch it. I realized I could struggle here, but I would lose. I needed to know exactly what kind of rights he was holding. I let go of the chair. The two men immediately carried it past me and loaded it into the truck. I turned my back, walked quickly to my car, and started the engine. I wasn't running away. I was going to look for my weapon. I drove to the bank through light sleet. The clerk checked the records faster than I expected. She said in a neutral voice, "The loan is valid, signed under power of attorney." I asked about the house. She looked at the screen again, then said slowly, "You no longer have legal rights here." When I returned, the driveway was empty. The truck was gone. The house stood there as it always had. The roof, the door, the porch, but inside something warm had been taken out. I sat in the car for a long time, my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the front door. Nothing had changed, except the name on it was no longer mine. I stepped into the living room and looked around. The things I had chosen, fixed, paid for were still there, unchanged, but my place in that space was different. I moved slowly, running my hand along the back of the chair, the edge of the table, the windowsill. Nothing had changed, and that was what unsettled me most. In the corner of the room, Helen's metal box sat under the low cabinet, the one I had never opened. I had left it there as a silent marker, thinking some things should be left alone. Today I pulled it out, cold metal, heavy. The lid was secured with a simple latch. I opened it. Inside were a few envelopes, a small notebook, and a letter placed on top, my name written in Helen's handwriting. I sat down, holding the letter. Thin paper, slightly yellowed. I opened it and read. Helen wrote plainly. No circling around. She wrote about Caleb, not in accusation, but with the caution of someone who had watched for a long time. She mentioned the times Caleb asked about documents, about signatures, about accounts. She wrote that she had suggested I revoke the old authorization, that she had told me I should keep a few boundaries. You trust too easily, she wrote, and you think kindness will protect itself. I folded the letter and set it on the table. None of it surprised me. It made me remember. Evenings when Helen stood in the kitchen, started a sentence, then stopped. Times she lingered longer than usual over the papers on the table. I had heard her. I just hadn't chosen to act. That afternoon, Caleb called. I let the phone ring a few times before answering. He spoke quickly, as if he assumed I already knew. I'll come by to talk, he said. I didn't object. Caleb arrived after dark. He walked in, looked around, then looked at me. I placed Helen's letter on the table without saying a word. Caleb read it, his expression barely changing. Mom worried too much, he said. I handed him the bank documents. He skimmed them, then set them down. I did everything legally, he said. You're not losing anything. I asked him about the loan. He explained with prepared words, investment, cash flow, optimization. I asked about ownership. He said it was to protect the assets. I didn't argue. I asked one question. Did you tell me? Caleb was silent for a moment. Then he said, You wouldn't have agreed. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the lake was dark, the wind stronger now. I thought of Helen's letter, of the word boundaries. I turned back and said slowly, This house no longer has my name on it, but I'm still here. Caleb looked at me as if weighing something. He nodded, said he would send the repayment schedule, said everything would be fine. When he left, I locked the door. I stayed in the living room and turned on a small lamp. The metal box was still open. I put Helen's letter back inside, closed the lid, but didn't lock it. On the table, the bank papers lay side by side, neatly aligned. I looked at them for a while, then put them away in a drawer. Night fell, and the house grew quiet. I didn't feel thrown out. I felt set aside. There's a difference, and that difference was enough to make me stand a little straighter. I went to see Laura in the late afternoon when the sun had dipped low and the city light had begun to change. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building near the Mississippi River. I parked under a bare maple tree and sat for a moment before going up. Not because I was afraid. I just wanted to arrive with a clear enough head not to turn the meeting into an interrogation. Laura opened the door after a few knocks. She looked thinner than the last time I saw her hair neatly tied back, a simple gray sweater. She looked at me, then stepped aside to let me in. The apartment was clean, sparsely furnished, a small wooden table, an old sofa, a bookshelf against the wall. No family photos on the walls. I noticed that right away and didn't ask. We sat facing each other. I set my hat on the table, still holding my keys. Laura poured tea and slid the cup toward me. She didn't look directly at me. Her eyes kept landing on the edge of the table, on her sleeve, anywhere but my face. I spoke first, briefly explaining what had happened. The paperwork, the bank, the house. I didn't embellish. I didn't use heavy words. I just stated the facts. Laura listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she knew some of it. Caleb had mentioned sorting out paperwork for me, said it was to keep things tidy. Laura hadn't asked more. "I thought you were fine," she said. "You're always fine." I asked if she knew about the loan. Laura shook her head. I asked about the old power of attorney. She shrugged, said that was complicated, involved the law. I didn't argue. I asked something else. "Can you help me?" Laura looked at me then. Her gaze was steady, not avoiding mine. "I don't want to be involved in your money matters," she said. The words landed on the table, light but final. There was no anger in them, just a boundary. I nodded. I didn't try to persuade her. I didn't say more. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Laura asked if I had eaten dinner. I said I wasn't hungry. She nodded and stood up to clear the cups. When I got up to leave, she hugged me, a brief, polite hug. "I hope you're okay," she said. I walked down the stairs slowly. Outside, the wind was colder. I sat in the car and looked up at her apartment window. The light was on. I didn't feel rejected. I felt not chosen, and that was different from before. On the drive home, I remembered when Laura was younger. Mornings driving her to school, afternoons when I came home late. I remembered thinking that providing was enough. I had been present, but not always there. The feeling came quickly, then passed. I didn't hold on to it. I let it move through me. When I got home, I opened the door and turned on the living room light. Helen's metal box was still in the corner, the lid unlocked. I didn't touch it. I hung up my coat and hat. My phone buzzed, a message from Caleb reminding me about the repayment schedule. I read it and didn't reply. I sat at the kitchen table and opened an old notebook. I wrote a few lines, the time, the names, what had happened. Not to complain, to remember. I wrote down Laura's words exactly. Then I closed the notebook. That night, I went to bed late. Not because I was worried, because I was rearranging the order of things in my head. There were people who didn't stand with me. There were people who didn't stand against me. And there were things that, if they were going to be done, I would have to do myself. When I turned off the light, the house was quiet as always, but my place in it was clearer. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. After washing the teacup that had gone cold long ago, I returned to the living room and pulled Helen's metal box out to the middle of the floor. The ceiling light reflected faintly off the scratched metal surface. Scratches I remembered making when I cleaned the house after the funeral, when everything felt rushed, and I just wanted to finish. I sat down and placed the box in front of me. Last time, I had opened it and closed it again, as if touching the truth too long might break it. This time, I opened it slowly. There was no sound. The lid lifted easily, without resistance. Inside was more than handwritten letters. Beneath the envelopes was a stack of documents neatly arranged in a clear plastic sleeve. I took them out and placed them on the table. Pages from banks, from an insurance company, from an investment account I had never held. In the top corner of each page, Helen had marked small, consistent symbols in blue ink. I turned the pages and read. The dates stretched back years, not just recent months. Small transactions at first, then larger ones. Caleb's name appeared in many places, sometimes as recipient, sometimes as representative. I stood up to get my glasses. When I returned, I read more carefully. There were transfers that moved out and then back again, looping through intermediary accounts. Withdrawals timed close to Caleb's loan payments. Copies of contracts, not ones I had signed, but agreements executed under power of attorney. In the margins, Helen had written short notes. Check again. Don't tell Arthur. Not certain yet. At the bottom of the box, I found a small notebook. The cover was worn, the spine frayed. Inside was Helen's handwriting, steady and regular. Not a diary. Records, dates, events, phrases. She had written down conversations between me and Caleb, things I didn't remember saying. One line read, Caleb asked about the signature again. Another, Arthur trusts. I sat back down, the notebook resting on my lap. The feeling in my chest didn't crash over me like a wave. It came slowly, heavy, like falling snow. Helen had suspected for a long time, not emotionally, through observation. She hadn't told me, not because she didn't think I could handle it, but because she feared I would collapse right then, feared I wouldn't be able to separate a son from the truth. Some people don't leave assets, they leave the truth. That sentence wasn't Helen's. It came to me like a space being filled. I understood why she chose silence. I also understood the cost of it. I put the documents back in order. I wasn't in a hurry. I photographed each page with my phone, saved them in a separate folder, labeled by date. I placed the originals back in the box. This time, I locked the lid. Not to hide them, to protect them. The next morning, I drove to the town library. Not to read the newspaper. I needed a computer, a printer, and quiet. I logged into my accounts, the ones that still allowed access. I checked histories, matched them against Helen's notes. There were gaps. There were overlaps. I printed the necessary pages, marked them in pencil, not ink. I called a local law office, the one that had confirmed the signature as formally valid. I made an appointment. I didn't say much over the phone. On the way home, I stopped by the lake. The wind was strong, the water rippled. I stood there for a few minutes looking out. I didn't think about Caleb. I thought about Helen. About evenings when she sat quietly reading while I watched television. About the times she asked if I was tired, then let it go. She had protected me in the quietest way, by not pulling me out of the world, but letting me stay in it until I could stand on my own. I went home, opened the door, hung up my coat. The house still didn't carry my name on paper, but some things inside it had shifted. I opened my notebook and wrote a few more lines, not feelings, tasks. I wrote the lawyer's name, the date and time, the list of documents. I wrote one short sentence, do not run. That afternoon, Caleb called. I listened without interrupting. He talked about the repayment schedule, about upcoming plans. I asked one question. How many times have you used my power of attorney? There was a pause on the other end. Then he gave a number. I didn't react. I only said, I'll be working with a lawyer. That evening, I cooked for myself. Something simple. I ate slowly, cleaned up. I placed the metal box on the high shelf in my study, locked it, and put the key in a drawer. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a moment. Not to fall apart, to get used to the fact that I was no longer standing outside my own story. When I went to bed, I didn't think about leaving. I thought about staying long enough to make everything clear. This wasn't the time to run. This was the time to begin. I didn't change my routine right away. I still woke early, made coffee, opened the window to look out over the lake as always. The difference was in the things I deliberately slowed down. I called Caleb to fix the sagging kitchen shelf, to take out the trash, to schedule furnace maintenance. Things I used to do myself, I now left undone. I let him see me hesitating over familiar tasks, as if my hands no longer worked the way they used to. Caleb came more quickly than before. He walked into the house with the air of someone who owned. Not the house, but the situation. Why? He looked at me, looked around, then sighed. "You should rest more," he said. I nodded. I let him fix the shelf, let him make decisions, let him arrange things. I didn't comment, I didn't object. Gradually, his tone changed. Not louder, not sharper, just shorter sentences, longer sighs. Once, when I dropped a plastic cup on the floor, Caleb said quietly, but clearly enough, "Useless old man." The words passed like a comment on the weather. I didn't react. I bent down to pick up the cup, my hands shaking just enough to look real. That evening, I slipped my phone into my shirt pocket and turned on the recorder before Caleb returned to the living room. I didn't look at the screen. I just listened. He talked about moving my bedroom downstairs, about how I shouldn't handle paperwork anymore. He used the word safe often. I asked one question. What rights do I still have in this house? He answered immediately, the right to peace. I stopped recording when he left. I didn't listen to it. I saved the file, named it by date, and placed it in the folder I had prepared. I continued to play the part of someone who didn't know. I asked naive questions and let him explain. I nodded. I let him believe everything was following the old trajectory, that I had accepted my new place. 2 days later, I drove out of town, heading south where the road narrowed and signs grew sparse. I went to the office of an independent lawyer, someone who didn't know Caleb, had no ties to the local bank. The office was small, old glass door, the smell of paper and coffee. He listened as I explained, reviewed the documents, looked at the photos. He didn't speak much. He asked a few precise questions and took brief notes. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he said slowly, "You have one move." I didn't ask more. I stood up, shook his hand, and set a return date. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I drove steadily, kept my distance. When I reached the house, I hung up my coat, set the keys where they belonged. I made coffee and sat watching the water grow darker. Caleb texted to ask if I needed anything. I replied, "No, I'm fine." I set the phone face down. In the silence, I practiced strategic silence, not to endure, but to wait for the right moment. I didn't tell Caleb about the appointment that day. I didn't bring anything with me except a thin folder of papers and a phone powered off. The county police station was more than 30 minutes from my house, on the other side of the old bridge. I arrived early and sat in the car for a few minutes before going in. Inside, it was quiet, evenly lit with white lights, the familiar smell of paper and cleaning solution. The duty officer listened as I explained, without interrupting. I spoke slowly, without excess emotion. I handed over documents, copies, photos of signatures. I signed the identity fraud complaint. My name appeared on both lines, victim and reporting party. I requested an independent signature examination, not to complain, to set the legal clock to the right rhythm. From there, things moved faster than I expected. The bank contacted me, confirming a temporary freeze on the relevant accounts while awaiting the examination results. An email came, then a phone call. I answered briefly to the point. I didn't add a story. I simply confirmed. Caleb showed up at the house that afternoon. He walked into the living room with a folder in his hand, his face tight. "What did you do?" he asked. I sat in the chair, my hands resting on the armrests. I said I had filed a report. I said I had requested a signature examination. I said everything was being handled. Caleb slammed his hand on the table. The sound was sharp, making the small lamp tremble. He spoke quickly, louder than usual, asking if I understood what I was doing. I didn't stand up. I looked straight at him. I said I understood enough not to step back. In that moment, my hands shook. Not much, just enough for me to feel it. I placed my other hand on my thigh and kept my breathing steady. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I let him finish talking, then said one sentence. "I've waited long enough." Caleb went quiet for a beat. Then he turned away and walked quickly out the door. The door closed hard. I stayed seated, the house silent. I didn't move right away. I let the trembling pass. Then I stood, got some water, and took a small sip. In the days that followed, the neighbors began to notice. A bank vehicle parked in front of the house. A stranger asked questions. I said hello and didn't say much. News traveled fast in a small town. I still took my morning walks, still nodded in greeting. The looks were different. I didn't avoid them. The examination results hadn't arrived yet, but the battle was already out in the open. I knew from that moment there was no way back, and I wasn't looking for one. Caleb came close to 10 p.m. when the wind off the lake was strong enough to make the window frames tremble slightly. I was in the living room, only half the lights on, the television off. I heard tires brake sharply outside, not the way he usually parked. The door opened hard enough to make the coat hook sway. He walked in without looking at me at first. His eyes swept quickly around the room, as if checking for something no longer where it should be. Then he turned and stood in the middle of the room, gripping a stack of papers. I recognized the bank logo in the corner of the top page. "What did you do?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it was rigid, tightly controlled. I didn't stand. I placed both hands on the armrests of the chair and kept my back straight. "I did what needed to be done," I said. Caleb let out a short laugh, one with no humor in it. He threw the papers onto the table. They slid apart. Messy. "My accounts are frozen," he said. "The bank called. The police called. How do you think this is going to end?" I looked at the papers, then at him. I didn't answer that question. Caleb stepped closer. The distance between us narrowed. "You're destroying everything," he said. "I had it all arranged." "You just needed to sit still." I stood up. Not fast, not slow. "Sitting still is how I was erased from my own life," I said. He slammed his hand on the table again, harder this time. The desk lamp shook, the light wobbling for a moment. "You're old," he said. "You don't understand. I'm saving you." I walked toward the window and looked out at the lake. The water was dark, the wind breaking it into layers. "Saving," I repeated. I turned back and looked straight at him. "Saving who?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He breathed hard, then said quickly, "You have to leave this house, tonight." The words landed without warning. No negotiation. I asked, "Why?" "Because you no longer have the right to be here," he said, "and because I won't let you keep making things worse." I walked toward the stairs, intending to go up to the bedroom. Caleb blocked me, standing across the first step. "No," he said, "just take your personal things. The rest, I'll handle." I looked at him. For a very brief moment I saw the face of the 20-year-old who once stood in the garage, hands stained with oil, asking me how to sign a check. The moment passed quickly. In front of me was someone else, the one guarding the door. "What are you doing?" I asked. Not angry, not afraid, just asking. Caleb didn't dodge it. "I'm ending this." I went back to the living room and took my coat from the hook. I bent down to pick up my wallet and phone. I walked slowly, slow enough to see everything. The chair Helen used to sit in, the old photo on the shelf, the scratch on the wooden floor. I stopped at the door. "I'll be back," I said. Caleb stood still. "No." The door closed behind me. Not loud, not dramatic, just a dry, final shut. Outside, cold wind cut across my face. I stood still for a few seconds, as if to be sure I was still breathing. Then I walked toward the car. I didn't turn on the house lights. I didn't look back. That night I slept in the car. The driver's seat fully reclined, my coat rolled up as a pillow. The wind rocked the car, waves hitting the shore in a steady rhythm. I cracked the window slightly to let air in. Cold, but enough to stay awake. At times I closed my eyes. At times I stared at the car ceiling, counting my breaths. I didn't think about Caleb. I thought about the door that had just closed. I thought about how some boundaries are only drawn when it's already too late. Near dawn, I got out of the car. A thin layer of frost covered the windshield. I stood in front of the house that no longer carried my name. I placed my hand on the wooden door. A brief touch, no knocking, no calling out. I turned away. In the morning, I went to the police station. I brought the final set of papers, copies Helen had left behind, notes, audio files organized by date. I placed them on the desk. The investigator looked at me, then at the documents. He asked a few short questions. I answered. I signed the confirmation. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive through words. When I left the station, it was fully daylight. I knew I would lose many things: the house, my peace, a few relationships. But there was one thing I no longer lost: the right to stand inside my own life. That afternoon, my phone vibrated. The investigator's voice on the other end was clear. The file was complete. An arrest warrant was being prepared. I said, "Thank you." I ended the call and looked out over the lake. The wind was still blowing, and this time I didn't lower my head. The morning Caleb was arrested, it didn't rain. There was no thunder, no strong wind. Everything unfolded under a pale, even light, as if the day had been born not to testify for anyone. I wasn't in the distant parking lot anymore. I stood at the start of the road leading to the lakeside house, only a few dozen steps from the front porch. I had arrived before them. I wanted to be there when it began. The police car pulled in without a siren. Tires crunched lightly on gravel. 2 officers stepped out and spoke briefly with Caleb right at the door. He was still wearing the gray jacket I had bought him for last winter. When they asked him to turn around, Caleb complied immediately. No arguing, no questions. He only paused slightly when the cold cuffs touched his wrists. In that moment, he looked around, like someone who had just lost their balance and was searching for something familiar to grab onto. And then he saw me. I didn't step forward right away. I let him look long enough to be sure he wasn't mistaken. Caleb's gaze fixed, then tightened. Not panic. Recognition. Late recognition, the kind that comes when you realize the room you thought was locked has had someone standing inside it all along. I took 1 step forward. Just one. Enough to stand level with the porch. Caleb stared at me, his hands cuffed in front of him. His shoulders sagged slightly, almost imperceptibly. I had never seen that posture on him. Not when borrowing money, not when lying, not when clearing things out of my house. This was the first time. "Dad," he said. Just 1 word. Nothing after it. I didn't answer right away. I took a small key from my coat pocket, Helen's safe key. I turned it slowly in my hand, letting the metal catch the light. Caleb saw it. I knew he did because his eyes dropped immediately. "You're very good at observing," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "But you forgot one thing." Caleb swallowed. The 2 officers stood still, not intervening. This wasn't their part. "There are people," I continued, "who also observe, longer than you think." I didn't say Helen's name. I didn't have to. He knew. Caleb's eyes flickered. A very small, very real reflex. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. There were no words left that fit. Laura stood by her car a few steps away. She had watched the scene from the beginning. When Caleb's eyes flicked toward her, searching, Laura didn't turn away. But she didn't step forward either. She stood still, hands clenched together, as if holding herself in the right place. I took another step, close enough that Caleb couldn't avoid my gaze. "I didn't come to win," I said. "I came to take my name back." Caleb looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded, a small, rigid nod like someone accepting something irreversible. No apology, no resentment, just the end of a game he thought he controlled. The officer signaled. Caleb was led away. As he passed me, he stopped for half a second, just long enough to whisper, "When did you know?" I looked straight into his eyes. "From the moment you thought I was already dead." I don't know if that hurt him. I only know it was the truth. The police car door closed. No siren, no dramatic clatter of metal, just the engine starting and rolling away down the familiar road. The house stood there, silent, as if it had never changed hands. Laura stayed a few seconds longer. She looked at me, her expression complex but unreadable. I nodded to her. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that she had been there, had witnessed it, and that was enough. When Laura left, I stood alone in front of the porch. This time, I wasn't shaking. That afternoon, I was called in to sign papers. The house was returned to me, on paper. Ownership restored. The bank sent confirmation. Everything followed procedure, clean and orderly. No one apologized. Justice isn't loud. I opened the door and stepped into the house as dusk settled. No one was there. None of Caleb's things. No sounds. The living room felt emptier than I remembered. Helen's armchair was gone. The bookshelf was half bare. On the floor were faint marks where furniture had once stood, lighter rectangles. I stood in the middle of the room and didn't sit right away. I slowly turned, looking at each corner. I pulled out a chair and sat in the center of the living room. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't turn on the main lights. Only the small lamp in the corner cast a weak yellow glow. I rested my hands on my knees, feeling the cold rise from the wooden floor. The moment stretched. I didn't count time. I let it pass. I hadn't won completely. The house returned, but hollow. The family didn't come back with it. I had my name on the papers again, but I had lost shared dinners, unnecessary questions, even the silences that once protected us. That was the cost. I stood and went upstairs. The bedroom was empty. The closet held only a few hangers. I opened a drawer and found a small key, the metal box key. I took it downstairs, opened the box. I took out Helen's letter and placed it on the table. I reread a short passage, then folded it. There was a very clear moment when I understood that I was no longer the person I used to be. The old me would have tried to fill the house immediately, would have made phone calls, would have looked for ways to reconnect. The old me would have asked, "What if?" I didn't do that. I cleaned slowly, kept what needed to be kept, let go of what no longer had a place. I chose silence. That night, I opened the window and looked out over the lake. The wind was light. The water was flat. I stood there longer than usual. I wasn't waiting for anything to return. I accepted what was there, a quiet house, a name no longer erased, and a man who had crossed a line that couldn't be reversed. When I turned off the lights, the house no longer felt unfamiliar. It was just different. And so was I. Not long after I returned to the lakeside house, the final court hearing took place. It moved faster than I expected, not because there was a lack of evidence, but because everything was clear enough that there was no need for long arguments. I sat in the back row, not too close, not too far. I didn't want to look at Caleb for too long, but I didn't avoid him either. He stood before the judge with a straight posture, his hands resting in front of his stomach. No shaking, no bowed head. When the lawyer read out the list of charges, financial fraud, falsifying records, misappropriation of assets through power of attorney, he only nodded slightly as if listening to the outcome of a meeting. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Caleb was silent for a few seconds. I waited. The whole room waited. "I did what I thought was right," he said. He didn't look at me. He didn't apologize. He didn't add any justification. Just one sentence, enough to close whatever hope remained. The sentence was handed down, not severe enough to be called destruction, but long enough not to be taken lightly. When the gavel came down, the sound was dry and final. I didn't feel relief. I felt an ending, and that ending came without any explanation for what was left behind. Laura didn't stay after the hearing. I saw her standing in the hallway, wearing a thin coat, holding her car keys. We looked at each other from a distance. She gave a very slight nod, the nod of someone who knew she had stood in the wrong place, but was fortunate enough to stop in time. I returned the look in the same way. No words were spoken, and none were needed. Her back disappeared behind the large glass doors of the courthouse, carrying with it the last remnants of what I once tried to build and call family. I went back to the lakeside house in the days that followed with a decision already formed. I cleaned each room, unhurried. I sorted my belongings into 3 piles: keep, give away, discard. The things I kept were fewer than I expected. I kept a few books, my old armchair, and Helen's metal box. That metal box was the only thing connecting me to a past I still valued. What about you? Is there a keepsake from someone long gone or an old object you refuse to throw away no matter where you move? If there is, tell me about it. Sometimes what we keep isn't an object, but a piece of memory. I sold the house after the paperwork was completed. Not because I needed the money, but because I no longer needed a space that large for a life that had changed its rhythm. On the day the buyers came to sign, I walked through the living room one last time. In the corner, the pendulum clock on the wall was still running, steady, patient. I stood in front of it and opened the back panel. I removed the battery and placed it in my palm. The second hand stopped. No sound. I closed the panel and hung it back. The clock stood still, like a period at the end of a sentence. I moved into a smaller apartment near a library and a park. I lived smaller, fewer things, less noise, fewer appointments. I walked every morning, bought coffee at a familiar cafe. I learned not to explain myself to strangers and not to need their understanding. Some evenings I opened Helen's letter, read a short passage, then put it away. I held no resentment. I didn't offer forgiveness either. Both require a kind of energy I no longer wanted to spend. The new boundary was simple. I kept my name, kept my right to choose, and didn't hand them over again. Everything else, family, the past, unanswered questions, I left where they belonged. When I turned off the lights each night, the room was quiet. And in that quiet, I stood upright. I moved to my new place on a very ordinary morning. No one asked where I came from. No one needed to know who I had been. The small apartment sat near a library and a park full of old trees. Every morning I walked past it, bought a cup of coffee at the corner shop, then sat by the window and read a few pages. That was enough. Here, no one knew I once had a house by the lake. No one knew my name had appeared in records I never wanted to open again. And I had no need to tell the story. My new life didn't require explanations. In the early days, the quiet made me feel unsteady. But then I realized, quiet isn't emptiness. It's space. Space to breathe at my own pace, to no longer hesitate each time I signed my name or wonder whether my kindness was being used by someone else. Some afternoons, sunlight slanted through the trees in the park as I sat on a wooden bench and watched people pass by. No one knew me, and for the first time in a long while, that made me feel safe. I took my name back, but I also learned that sometimes the price of justice is the silence that follows. I hold no bitterness. I don't try to forget. I simply put everything in its proper place and move on. If there's one thing I keep for myself after all of this, it's this. Boundaries don't push people farther apart. They only prevent us from disappearing into someone else's life. If you're listening to this story in a quiet moment of your own, tell me where you are or what stage of life you're in. One comment is enough. If this story touched you, please like it. If you think someone out there needs to hear it, share it. And if you want to stay with stories that are slow, honest, and respectful to the listener, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This video was supported by AI and edited and refined by humans to offer reflection and human value. It does not encourage imitation. Thank you for staying until the end. I'm still here, and if you come back, I'll tell you more stories.